This video is sponsored by TrueFire. Over 2 million guitar players worldwide improve their playing using TrueFire's online lesson systems. Learn, practice, and play with TrueFire. Hi, this is Keith Williams. Welcome to 5-Watt World. We're interested in helping you get the most music from the least gear. When I posted that I was going to work on a short history of Martin guitars, you all told me that it would have to be over an hour long. Emblazoned on the headstock, everyone seems to know that Martin has been building guitars since 1833. Tradition and enduring quality, rather than wild innovation, is what Martin's reputation has been built on. It could be argued that Martin's greatest contribution to acoustic guitar building was the development of X bracing in the beginning of the 20th century. But you could also argue that the most enduring and far-reaching Martin design was the final say in acoustic guitars, the Dreadnaught. A guitar which luthier T.J. Thompson suggests, quote, should come with a warning. If I put one of those old Dreadnaughts in your hands, you'll never forget it. You'll long for it, and you'll sell any holdings in real estate you have, and your marriage will end, and your kids won't go to college, but you'll be happy because you have a Dreadnaught. We'll talk about the history of these masterpieces here, but I think more importantly, as it should be with any instrument history, I will rely heavily on the history of the musicians that made these guitars famous. The sound of a Martin Dreadnought is unmistakable, and its story is one of craftsmanship, consistency, and influence unmatched in the world of acoustic guitars. So if you want to know more about the story of this magical machine, stay tuned, because this is the 5-Watt World short history of the Martin Dreadnought guitar. If you enjoy our videos, take a minute to subscribe and hit the bell icon to be notified when we put out new videos. And swing by the store, grab a t-shirt or a hoodie to support what we're doing here. And if you don't need another hoodie, but want to become a bigger part of 5-Watt World, think about becoming a friend of 5-Watt. And in response to requests, I've added a tip jar as well. The links are in the description. Martin's founder, Christian Friedrich Martin, was born in Eastern Germany in 1796. He was trained as a furniture builder, but he became interested in building instruments, particularly guitars. He convinced his father to pay for an apprenticeship at the famous Stauffer workshops in Vienna, Austria, when he was just 15 years old. After completing his apprenticeship, he and a partner went out on their own, but they didn't do particularly well in Vienna. By this time, Christian was married, and they decided to return to his hometown, which had a rich history in violin building, and they were coming around to building guitars as well. Unfortunately for Christian, the strict system in Germany didn't recognize his training in Austria, so rather than repeat the lengthy apprenticeship again, when his father died, he packed up his tools, some guitars, and set out for the U.S. with his wife, son, and daughter. It's generally believed that he brought some instruments with him to sell upon arrival to both generate some cash, but also to begin to establish his reputation as a guitar builder. They settled in Manhattan and opened a shop at 196 Hudson Street. They worked there for 5 years, with partners and relatives helping in the shop at times, but none staying on for long. In the Martin family, it's generally believed that it's Christian's wife that convinced him to move to Nazareth, Pennsylvania, where the German population was so great that people spoke German and ate German food. And so, in 1859, the family had bought a piece of property in the center of town at the corner of North and Main Streets. In Dick Boak's book, Inventing the American Guitar, he outlines the growing popularity of Spanish-style gut-string guitars in the U.S. The Spanish companies wanted to sell their guitars in the U.S., but when they tried to import them, the radically different climate in the States wreaked havoc with the construction used by the Spanish builders. Coming from his furniture design background, Christian used a dovetail joint to join the neck to the body. Using this joint meant that the neck was joined to the guitar much later in the building process, unlike a traditional Spanish build where the neck was integral to the neck block. But tradition was strong in guitar building, and Martin went out of his way to make the neck joint look like a Spanish-style neck joint. Most importantly, because the guitars were being built in the U.S., the woods and joints were already acclimated to the climate, and so the guitars lasted. In the 1800s, guitars were small and meant to be played in homes as part of family performance. But by 1850, there was a growing demand for larger and louder guitars. These became the double O guitars. In 1888, CF died and Frank Henry took over at the age of 22. In 1893, the mandolin was becoming popular in the U.S., with banjo and mandolin orchestras drawing significant crowds. So Martin began to build the traditional roundback mandolins, later moving to flatback mandolins. But the demand for louder guitars kept growing, and by 1901, Martin was building the triple O guitars. The guitar and mandolin band craze was in full force, but it's the growth and popularity of Hawaiian music that is most integral to the Martin story. In 1915, there was a Pan-Pacific Universal Exposition, essentially a World's Fair, and at the fair there was a pavilion that highlighted Hawaiian culture, including music played on ukuleles. This proved very popular, so Martin bought some Hawaiian-made ukuleles, copied them, and began selling them hand over fist. They had to add an entire addition to the factory to accommodate the demand for ukuleles at the time. In 1924, Martin sold 14,000 ukuleles. The craze for ukuleles lasted right up to the Depression, and now with the internet, they're back and more popular than ever. After building guitars commercially for 75 years, Martin ironically had its first big success building these little instruments. And interestingly, the lessons Martin learned building their smallest instruments would prove key to building their largest, the Dreadnought. In 1915, Martin had built a custom guitar for a Hawaiian music star that was 1/2 inch wider and 1/2 inch longer than their triple O. The folks at the Oliver Ditson Company, Martin's distributor in New York City, managed to learn of this custom instrument. They were looking for a guitar that they could market to the new Hawaiian music groups. So Harry Hunt of Ditson, Frank Henry Martin, and a young Martin employee named John Deitman worked together to design and build the first guitar to fill this order. This guitar would become the first Dreadnought-style guitar. It was like the earlier enlarged triple O, but it had a wider waist, deeper bass, and more volume. Ditson commissioned a number of the guitars to be built in this new body shape and called it a bass guitar. But within the company, Frank Martin named the guitar the largest one they'd ever built, the Dreadnought, after the world's biggest battleship, which had been launched in 1906. Ditson's company catalog simply listed it as the Model 111. It was still a 12-fret guitar, and until 1917 was built out of rosewood and braced for gut strings. Martin built the guitars, but as was common at the time, they were marketed under Ditson's own brand name, and this would be true for a decade. In 1922, Martin offered their first steel string models, and by the next year, all the Style 18 guitars were steel strings. They transitioned the rest of the line slowly, but by 1929, even the fancy Style 45 guitars were only made for gut on special order. The steel strings were far less expensive and were louder than gut, and the new X bracing proved perfect for the steel strings as well. By the late 20s and early 30s, the traditional wrap-style classical bridges were being replaced with pin bridges. Using a pin bridge where holes are drilled down through the top was problematic for the traditional fan bracing styles used on classical guitars that still dominates the classical guitar building world today. But the fans running out and away from the sound hole made the pin bridges difficult to position. It's believed that Martin evolved the X bracing as he slowly moved the braces out of the way until the new X pattern bracing to support the top was adopted. The long braces running along the sides of the sound hole were then the rest of the X-brace pattern. These were the first X-brace guitars ever made. Christian's son CF had joined the business and was learning to build guitars as well. CF continued his father's designs but slowly built the factory's output up. They continued to invest in new tooling and fixtures to streamline the building process. The 20s had been a boom time in the economy, and the production from those years had been slowly growing. On October 24, 1929, the stock market crashed. The guitars that had already been shipped to dealers sold very slowly over the next few years. Guitar production at the factory slowed to a crawl, and some instruments sat on the bench or in racks for years, waiting completion. During the Depression, the company looked for ways to make the guitars more affordable. They removed the ornamentation and went to an all-mahogany top. These factors combined allowed them to cut the price in half to $25, and they sold a lot of these cheaper guitars. These included guitars set up as Hawaiian-style guitars. The first truly modern Martin guitar was made for Perry Bechtel, a famous vaudeville banjo player. Bechtel realized that the banjo boom was coming to an end, and he decided to switch to guitar. He came to Martin with his reactions to the guitar necks of the time, and asked them if they couldn't make a guitar neck that was more like a banjo neck. They borrowed the 14-fret design from the short time they'd been building archtop guitars. They took a 12-fret triple O, squared off the shoulders, radiused the typically flat fingerboard, and built him a guitar. Bechtel liked the guitar, and Martin decided to try this slimmer and faster neck in the marketplace, and people loved it. This would be the OM-28. Martin began to transition over time to build nearly all guitars with 14 fret rather than 12 fret necks. With the longer, slimmer neck, solid headstock, and pickguard on the face of the guitar, the OM is considered the first modern flat-top guitar. The OM-28 is itself a watershed development, and its continued popularity and use by countless artists proves that Martin more or less got it right from the start. The headstocks on these earliest guitars were unadorned, and it would be 1932 before the now familiar gold script logo was added, and 1933 before all models would wear it. By the Depression, the Dreadnought was only selling about 14 guitars a year, and in the troubled economy, the Ditson Distributing Company went out of business. While not selling particularly well, Martin decided to continue to make the Dreadnoughts under their own name. Though they were slow to promote the big guitar, it would prove to be the source of their greatest success, even though they did not list the Dreadnought in the catalog until 1935. In 1931, the first two models came out under the Martin name. Both 12-fret guitars, they were called the D1 and the D2, but soon those names would be changed and would forever after be called the D-18 and the D-28. The first D-28s that were ever made had a 12-fret neck and reside in the museum at Martin and was previously owned by actor and philanthropist Richard Gere. By 1931, the guitars were fully X-braced, and it had what is referred to as a belly bridge, replacing the older rectangular pyramid bridge. It also had gained a pickguard. In 1934, there was a move to the 14-fret neck, and the basic shape had come together. To accomplish this, they squared off the shoulders, effectively pushing the sides down toward the bridge to get those last two frets clear of the body, abandoning the sloped shoulder design that was more typical of the era. Throughout the Depression, Martin continued to offer a wide array of models in an attempt to tempt buyers. The 14-fret D-18 quickly became Martin's bestseller, outstripping all but the low-cost O-17s. During those lean years, nearly 3 times more D-18s were sold than D-28s. It's important to note that Martin survived the Depression when most other instrument manufacturers went bust. They were able to do so because generations of Martins had made conservative business practices the norm, and as a company, they carried very little debt. They were innovative, but evolved models slowly to gauge the market. The growth of radio, with their simple early microphones, called for louder guitars as well. In 1933, Gene Autry was the original singing cowboy, a bona fide country music star. He made dozens of movies and would sell over 100 million records. With this newfound fame, he ordered a fancy custom Dreadnought from Martin, the first D-45. All of those images of Gene Autry gave the world a look at the big and lavish guitar, which was quite different from the D-18 and D-28. Despite demand, over the next 9 years, Martin would build just 91 D-45s until they stopped production in 1942 after the start of World War II. These are some of the most sought-after instruments in the world today. When I was interviewing George Gruen about bursts from the late 50s, he commented that he believes that once the current generation of wealthy collectors dies off, the Les Pauls may drop in value. But he likened the value of an original D-45 to that of a Stradivarius violin, an instrument of such fine quality that it will forever be prized. The D-45s sold for $300. At the time, Martin's top-of-the-line archtop guitars cost $350. When the Martin Museum purchased a vintage fancy Martin archtop for their collection, they had to pay $18,000 for it. When they went around looking to buy and finally purchased an original D-45 for their collection, they had to pay $180,000 for it. World War II was a hard time for the company, with much of the workforce going off to war. To fill in for the men making that immense sacrifice, Martin hired and trained women to build the guitars. When the war was over, the women left. However, if we fast forward to the present day, fully half the builders at Martin are women. By the end of World War II, the Dreadnought had become sought after by country music stars. Hank Williams, widely considered the father of modern country music, famously used a D-28. Before his early death at the age of 29, he wrote most of his hits on that guitar, establishing the D-28 as the guitar for country music. Johnny Cash said that he always felt safe holding a Dreadnought. By the mid-40s, guitarists were often using heavier gauge strings originally intended for archtop guitars on their Martin flat tops. To compensate for this, Martin stopped using scallop bracing by late 1944. The diamond, square, and fretboard inlays were also replaced on the Style 21 and 28 guitars with plain dots around the same time. And finally, in 1946, the herringbone inlay that had adorned the tops of all the Style 28 guitars for nearly a century was replaced with simpler black and white celluloid lines. Frank Henry Martin, the man that had shepherded the company through the time now thought of as their golden era, retired in 1945 and died just a year later at the age of 81. He'd carried the company through its boom and bust years and ended up producing some of the most sought-after instruments in the world during his tenure as head of the company. His name belongs next to Ted McCarty and Leo Fender as one of the greatest leaders of any instrument company in U.S. history. Out of the explosion of country music, bluegrass began to form. Bill Monroe's band, the Bluegrass Boys, had their first performance in August of 1945 in the Ryman Auditorium, and from that point on, Dreadnaught sales took off. Monroe created the Bluegrass Ensemble, and though he himself was a mandolin player, he was looking for a strong rhythmic bed. Influenced by country and blues, he was a big fan of the Dreadnaught, so much so that he bought a Martin guitar to be used in his band, even though a number of different guitarists would come and go playing Monroe's guitar. In 1963, Monroe hired Del McCrory as a banjo player and alternate high harmony singer. Soon McCrory was also playing Monroe's 1939 D-28 herringbone. McCrory said that Monroe's Martin has a unique tone, and that he believes that each Martin Dreadnought has its own voice. The Dreadnought was the perfect instrument for the picked lines of the growing legion of bluegrassers. Doc Watson bought his D-18 on installment in 1940. His playing would influence generations to come, including a young Clarence White. White would sit night after night watching Doc, and he incorporated those sounds into his own quick and explosive style. White's band, the Kentucky Colonels, took bluegrass into the modern era on the back of his own D-28. After World War II, the ukulele saw a resurgence in popular music as Hawaiian music had a second coming, along with the popularity of musicians like Arthur Godfrey. Martin was in a perfect position to meet the demand, and ukulele sales again helped bolster Martin's sales numbers, with 11,000 being sold in 1950 alone. Elvis Presley had grown up listening to Jimmie Rodgers and Hank Williams. Wanting to be like them, he wanted a Martin guitar of his own. In 1954, Sam Phillips encouraged Elvis, and he came in to cut some demos. The story goes that on a break from recording, Elvis was strumming his D-18 and launched into a rendition of Arthur Crudup's "That's All Right, Mama." And with that, Phillips knew which way to go with the young singer. Elvis would use that guitar on stage throughout his early career. As seemed to be common, the innovation of one generation of Martins was followed by a move back to more conservative choices by the next, and the time with Frederick Martin was one such period at the company. He was glad to sell the new big Dreadnought, but his aesthetic leaned more towards simplicity and elegance. The only exception seems to be the 1955 introduction of the D-21 as an instrument halfway between the D-18 and the D-28. In the late 50s, in response to those wanting to amplify their flat tops for the new amplified music, Martin offered their E-series instruments with volume and tone pouts mounted on the top. Fans of Martin acoustics look on this year with disdain, as half of the D-18 sold that year had pickups and knobs seen as defacing the top of the guitars in 1959. Kurt Cobain, ever the champion of ugly duckling guitars, would famously use a D-18E on his 1993 MTV Unplugged performance. Despite deep back orders for their acoustic guitars, Martin couldn't resist trying their hand at producing some electric guitars in the 60s. The craftsmanship of the wood in these guitars was up to par, but the hardware and electronics were deeply lacking, and after brisk sales of the guitars in '61, out of novelty, sales collapsed by the second year. In their book, Martin Guitars, A History, Johnston and Boak mourned the loss of production that could have built more D-18s and D-28s that instead was used to build the electrics. The electric line would struggle on with the GT series electrics until they were all discontinued in '67. Folk music had become one of the dominant forms of pop music prior to the advent of rock and roll. Rising in popularity on both sides of the Atlantic, folk music grew in the middle of the 1950s originally, and in New York City especially, and from the movement came Bob Dylan playing a Martin. The Kingston Trio's popularity similarly drove considerable growth in the folk music boom. Teenage and college kids wanting to emulate the Kingston Trio wanted to buy Martin guitars as well. Not only that, but pop folk sensation Simon & Garfunkel's Paul Simon was frequently seen with a D-18, including on the cover of 1964's Wednesday Morning 3 a.m. Unfortunately, Martin seemed unable to grow production to meet the demand generated by the folk music boom, producing just 6,000 guitars a year. It was a time to move out of the original multi-floor North Street factory to a new single-floor modern factory. building that they put up on Sycamore Street in 1964, where the factory remains to this day. The new production paved the way for the first new models in many years, with the D-12-20 12-string being launched in the 1965 catalog. It listed for $330, compared to $250 for a D-18 in the same pages. Based on the old 12-fret Dreadnaught, it even carried a slotted headstock. But the young players didn't follow the old 12-string player's practice of tuning down a half or a whole step, and instead tried tuning to concert pitch, creating massive problems for the models that still had no truss rod. Despite the problems, they sold over 1,000 of the D-12-20s each year from '67 to the mid-'70s, when it was superseded by the 14-fret D-12-18. Martin had been importing Brazilian rosewood logs and supervising the cutting to maximize the usable wood. But now, logs large enough to make two-piece backs were becoming more scarce. In response, they developed a three-piece back, tweaking the design to retain the resonance of the two-piece backs. The guitars were given bound fretboard. They named the model the D-35. A 12-string D-12-35 followed. Despite the design tweaks, the guitars sound as different from a D-28 as they looked. Whether it was Dylan going electric at Newport or the Byrds that created folk rock, it can't be denied that it kept the Dreadnought in the hands of popular musicians at the end of the 60s. Crosby, Stills and Nash, Judy Collins, Joan Baez, Bob Dylan, Don McLean, the Beatles were all playing Dreadnoughts. Buffalo Springfield opened for the Byrds, and it brought David Crosby, Stephen Stills, and Graham Nash together at a party. As Crosby, Stills, and Nash, they played their second gig ever at the Woodstock Festival, playing their Dreadnoughts and reminding the world of the power of the acoustic music in the age of the electric guitar. Playing Sweet Judy Blue Eyes to 400,000 people with two voices and Stephen Stills' single D-45. The wild success of Crosby, Stills, and Nash, and later Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young, made Martin a name known across the industry, where they had previously been known primarily in bluegrass and country music circles. Pulling the two worlds together, Clarence White would join the Byrds as a featured guitarist from '68 to '73, and would flat-pick fiddle tunes as part of their live shows, playing Black Mountain Rag and Soldier's Joy. Clarence died young, and at some point had lost the guitar as collateral for a loan, but fortuitously, his guitar ended up with his heir apparent, Tony Rice, who had actually played the guitar backstage on an occasion in the past. That unique guitar has a larger sound hole. Whether that was due to a cigarette burn or was due to wear around the sound hole that was eventually repaired, leaving the hole larger, we're not sure. But it had a unique tone due to that feature, and enlarged sound hole dreads still have some popularity today, with many smaller shops offering them as custom orders. Tony Rice brought that guitar with him to the David Grisman Quintet, taking that guitar and the genre to a new level in that band. Licks that were so much more complex than anything that came before, they're almost hard to take in. Tony was immensely fond of the guitar, having it repaired repeatedly through the years, and his iconic tune, Church Street Blues, even references it. In 1968, the D-45 was brought back into production after being out of production since World War II. With a list price of $1,200, it was the most expensive flat top in the country by a long shot. And the next year, Martin brought out the very successful D-41. With an inlay pattern specifically designed so guitars couldn't be made into fake D-45s, they were launched at 2/3 the price of a D-45 and outsold them 4-1. 12-fret S versions of both models were offered, and even 12-string versions of both models of pearl-bordered guitars appeared in the 1971 catalog. The success of these guitars paved the way for what we might call luxury guitars of the contemporary years. Details had continued to evolve on the Dreadnought. In '66, the Ivoroid binding had replaced real ivory. In 1916, was replaced with stark white plastic. The faux tortoise pickguards were replaced with black plastic as well. In late 1969, early 1970, Martin stopped using Brazilian rosewood due to Brazil imposing a ban on exporting complete logs. They moved to East Indian rosewood, and if the market noticed a big difference in sound, the sales numbers didn't show it. The peak production came with 22,637 guitars shipped in 1971. With this huge growth in output, like in other parts of the musical instrument industry, the 70s are seen as a lower quality moment for Martin. They had beefed up the braces and replaced the thin maple bridge plate with a heavier rosewood one. Both changes were designed to keep string action and customer complaints low, not out of desire to improve the tone of the guitars. Of course, acoustic guitar had a solid place in popular music throughout the 70s. Business was booming, and in response, Martin bought the Darko String Company from the Diodarios, the Vega Banjo and Drum Company, and the Goya guitar brand too. When the boom fell off at the end of the 70s, all of these side businesses would fail, except for the string company. The ability to produce their own strings has proven itself over the past decades as a diversified source of income. String production would be moved from the original factories in Long Island to Nazareth in 1983, and the string factory has now been in Mexico for over 25 years. The acoustic guitar business boom came to an end by the end of the 70s. Guitars in general dropped in popularity, and synthesizers came along with the Yamaha DX7. Disco ushered in a new era of dance halls with pre-recorded music, and it severely reduced the popularity of local live music for decades. Though the shift in music styles was a challenge, new competition was coming from imported guitar brands. Martin responded by creating their own import company under the Sigma brand, but companies like Takamine copied the Martin aesthetic to the letter and hurt lower-end sales. But it was more than the advent of keyboards, import guitars, or even the Saturday Night Fever soundtrack. There were many new American guitar manufacturers coming out on the scene at the time. Gurion, Mossman, and Taylor in the States and Larrivee in Canada were now vying for the piece of the shrinking acoustic guitar market. Gibson was having its own problems, but Guild was still churning out a full line of acoustics. After years of boom sales, Martin was now competing with the sale of their own guitars on the used market as well. Add to this that they had been made cash poor by their boom year acquisitions, and these were hard times at Martin. After the peak in 1971, their production dropped to a year where they said they struggled to make 3,000 guitars. As sales fell off, Martin used its old strategy of launching new models, and in 1979 they announced the formation of the Martin Custom Shop, predating the custom shops at Fender and Gibson by a good number of years. It offered customers and dealers the chance to order guitars from a list of customizations, and it let unique guitars be built and marketed. It had the additional benefit of letting Martin know what people were interested in paying for. One of these guitars was a custom run of pearl-covered guitars for the 1980 Neiman Marcus catalog with inlay by Dave Nichols. Another example was the HD-28 variant called the Custom 15, the name coming from the fact that it was the 15th custom order that year. The Custom 15 was not only put back the scallop bracing of the vintage guitars, but it moved the X bracing closer to the sound hole as it had been on the earliest Dreadnaught. They also added Style 25 and 37 guitars, bringing an Alcoa Dreadnaught back after a 40-year absence from the line. Unfortunately, not all of these guitars sold well, and it was expensive to have guitars not shipping at an already cash-poor company. The first cutaways were built in 1981 with the DC-28. This after many, many years of resisting requests from players. They built them with an oval sound hole, almost out of spite it seemed at finally meeting the request. The cash flow was helped by the Sigma import line, Martin's own copies of everything from the D-18 to the D-41s made in Japan and later in Korea. The success of the Sigma line even made them experiment with importing 2,500 unfinished guitars for finishing at the Martin factory, labeled Sigma Martin on the headstock. These were the DR-28N and the DR-35N. The Sigma Martin guitars led them to further collaborations with Japanese factories in the form of the Shenandoah series in 1983. With bodies and necks from Japan, the guitars were assembled and finished in the Martin factory, qualifying them for a Made in the USA stamp, as more than 50% of the value was added at a factory in the US. The model numbers were patterned after Martin models, with the suffix 32 added. By the 80s, acoustic guitar was gaining in popularity again, with new singer-songwriters and solo fingerstyle guitarists releasing music for steel string acoustic guitars. In addition to huge success from Will Ackerman and Leo Kottke, most prominent among these was Windham Hill artist Michael Hedges, with his inventive open tunings and his D-28. In country music, artists like bluegrass-rich Ricky Skaggs were becoming more popular with his mix of high bluegrass vocals and mainstream country tunes. The late 80s saw more interesting changes. Martin went back to the pre-1970s lighter top bracing in the HD-28, and the D-45 and D-41s followed. They also built a maple Dreadnaught. As the 80s came to a close, it seemed you could hear acoustic guitar everywhere again. This included a hugely popular TV show, 30-something, which had an acoustic guitar-driven theme written and played by Snuffy Walden. In fact, the entire show featured a steel string-driven soundtrack. In November of 1989, the first episode of MTV's Unplugged, a show where electric bands would sit down and play acoustic versions of their hit songs, aired. As the 90s came on, the acoustic came back strong. Unplugged brought it back with a vengeance. Eric Clapton, Neil Young, Paul McCartney, Kurt Cobain, Bob Dylan, everyone playing Martin guitars. Martin saw a huge resurgence in sales and interest in acoustic guitar in general. This sparked the interest of a new generation of players, including Jason Isbell, Sturgill Simpson, John Mayer, William Tyler, the Civil War's John Paul White, and the Avett Brothers. 1991 saw Martin out from under the cloud of the 80s, and they continued to try new things. They offered cedar-top versions of the HD-28 and HD-35, but neither guitar sold well. Their Guitars of the Month program offered a D-28 LSH for large sound hole. This was Martin's response to watching companies like Santa Cruz and Collings offering close copies of the 1935 D-28 played by Clarence White and then Tony Rice. Collings was making signature models for both White and Rice at the time, so their names weren't mentioned in the release. It was their best-selling Guitar of the Month by far, with 211 sold. The business had turned around and an incredible range of guitars was offered throughout the 90s. In 2001, this included the fanciest ever Dreadnaught, the D-50. A dazzling pearl-encrusted guitar with a $50,000 price tag. Despite that price, all 50 guitars sold out quickly. In 2004, Martin showed up at the NAMM show with a stunning one-off Dreadnought to celebrate their 1 millionth guitar produced. It was never built to be sold, but they did a run of Dreads tagged as the D-100 with similar style appointments. As the D-50 was $50,000, it's easy to follow along and estimate the price of each D-100. And each carried a serial number starting with 1 million. They're now faced with the challenge of a market that perceives high-quality guitars being built from rare and exotic hardwoods. They're looking to sustainable forestry, and they're looking to alternative materials. So by the time current CEO's Chris Martin's daughter, Claire Francis, yes, CF, is in the business, the new forest might be ready to be harvested. Coming into the 21st century, guitar is the most popular instrument, and the Dreadnought is by far the most popular size and style of that guitar in the world. I've partnered with TrueFire because I've used them for over a decade, and my playing always improves when I put in the time on their lessons. Whether you're a beginner, intermediate, or professional level player, TrueFire has lessons to inspire and advance your playing. As you know, I always promote spending money on lessons before new gear. I really like TrueFire, and I think if you give them a shot, you'll like them too. Get 25% off courses using the promo code 5watt25, or like I have for many years, sign up for the All Access Pass to use the entire TrueFire catalog. You can sample anything in the catalog with the All Access Pass and see where the muse takes you. I love their tagline, learn, practice, and play with TrueFire. I'd like to thank TrueFire for partnering with me and sponsoring this video. Chris Martin tells a story of how a young guitar player might follow a current player like John Mayer, only to learn that Mayer was greatly influenced by Bob Dylan. So they go and they read about all the interviews they can find with Bob Dylan, who says he was greatly influenced by a guy named Woody Guthrie. And in all these cases, the young guitar player sees their guitar heroes playing Martin guitars. Generations of players proving Martin is the best, by test. And one final story before I go. My favorite, actually. Neil Young lent a tour bus to Bob Dylan. When it was returned, there was a nice old Martin D-28 in the back. When Neil finally got on the phone with him, Dylan told him that it was Hank Williams' original guitar, and that he wanted Neil to have it as a thank you. Perhaps more than the vintage electric guitars, which seem to be disappearing into ever more concentrated sets of collections, Martins, like the instruments of Stradivarius and Guarneri, seem to find their way into the hands of players. And the idea of Hank Williams' guitar in the hands of one of the preeminent songwriters of the last 50 years is as fitting a place for that instrument as I can imagine. First, I need to thank Corey Congillio. I had to shift to covering the Dreadnoughts first and needed a player at the last minute. Corey's been a Martin clinician for many years, and as you can hear, he was the right choice. Check out Corey's TrueFire courses to learn how to make your Dread sing like his does. This video would not have been possible without the book Martin Guitars, A History by Richard Johnston and Dick Boak. In an interesting twist for such a long company history, I found that recent video interviews with CEO Chris Martin were an incredible help in helping put this together. In particular, the Martin-produced Ballad of the Dreadnought video here on YouTube was very helpful, and I recommend it to anyone interested in this history. I need to thank my script editor, and in this case co-author, for his insight into the script. He has yet to buy his ultimate acoustic guitar, but Lord knows he's doing the research, and we're all benefiting from it here. And I need to thank the Friends of 5W, an ever-growing group of guitar obsessives, and I appreciate you for all the support you give 5W World. If you enjoyed this short history of the Martin Dreadnought, hit the like button, and if you haven't subscribed yet, go ahead and hit that too. Until next time, thanks for being a part of the 5W World.